Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know, when you stand on the street and look up at a massive skyscraper, it's it's really easy to just focus on the glass and the steel.
Right, you just admire the finished product.
Yeah, we almost never stop to think about the foundation. We don't think about the muddy excavations or, the millions of tons of concrete poured in the dark.
Or the intense structural compromises that were made deep underground just to keep the whole monolithic structure from sinking.
Exactly. And when we look at the vast, enduring legacy of the Mughal Empire in India, we are usually just looking at the glass and steel. Today, we are going deep underground.
We're going to examine the foundation, and that foundation is intensely complex.
It really is.
It was poured over 3 centuries, very often while the builders were actively under attack. It wasn't a clean process at all. It was constantly being ripped up, rebuilt, redesigned, and patched together through sheer force of will.
So we are taking a comprehensive, highly detailed deep dive into the source material. We're looking at the Delhi Sultanate. We're covering 320 years of history, stretching from 1206 to 1526. And we are examining the 5 distinct dynasties that ruled from Delhi over this period.
That's the Mamluk or slave dynasty, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids, and finally the Lodis.
But for you listening, we're not just going to recite a list of kings and battles that is surface-level stuff.
Yeah.
We want to get into the intricate machinery of the Sultanate.
Yeah, we're going to pull apart its economy, its espionage networks, the actual physical mechanics of its military innovations, and the profound cultural synthesis that was happening right there on the street level.
It's a critical period to understand, because before 1206, the Islamic presence in the subcontinent was mostly characterized by temporary incursions or, very localized regional holds.
Right, raids mostly. The Delhi Sultanate established the very first stable, enduring Islamic rule over massive portions of the Indian subcontinent. The sheer scale of the administrative undertaking required to make that happen is staggering.
So let's look at how you actually build an empire from scratch in a newly conquered territory. This takes us into the genesis of the empire, looking at the Mamluk machinery from 1206 to 1290.
The stage was actually set by the Ghurid conquests.
Specifically, the victories of Muhammad of Ghor at the battles of Tarain in 1191 and 1192.
Yeah, he defeats the Rajput Confederacy, but Muhammad of Ghor was a conqueror. He didn't stick around to govern.
Right. He leaves.
He left his former slave general, Qutb-ud-Din Aibak, to manage these newly conquered territories in northern India.
And when Muhammad of Ghor dies in 1206, Aibak doesn't pack up and go home. He declares independence and establishes the Delhi Sultanate.
Now, the term slave dynasty or Mamluk requires a little bit of context.
Yeah, because it sounds strange to modern ears.
Exactly. In the Islamic world at this time, military slavery was a highly formalized institution. These weren't menial laborers, they were elite soldiers.
They were often purchased as young boys from Central Asia, right?
Yes. Converted to Islam and trained exclusively for war and administration. They could rise to immense power.
It's almost a brutal form of meritocracy. You don't get your position because your father was a duke. You get it because you survived and excelled in this intense military hierarchy.
Right. And Aibak's reign is short. He dies in 1210.
Supposedly from a polo accident.
Which is a very elite way to go.
Yeah, it is. But he lays the initial groundwork. The real consolidation of this new state comes with his son-in-law, Shams-ud-Din Iltutmish.
Iltutmish is the architect of the early state. He rules from 1211 to 1236, and he realizes very quickly that military might is not enough to hold a subcontinent.
You need legitimacy. You need a reason for people to accept your right to tax them and order them into battle.
Exactly. So in 1229, he seeks external validation by receiving caliphal investiture from the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad.
But, why does a piece of paper from Baghdad matter to a guy holding a sword in Delhi?
Because the Muslim community, the Ummah, was theoretically a single political and spiritual entity under the caliph.
Even if the caliph's actual military power in Baghdad was waning.
Right, his religious authority was absolute. By receiving this formal document of investiture, Iltutmish transforms his rule.
He goes from being a successful warlord occupying foreign territory to a legally recognized sovereign in the eyes of the entire Islamic world.
It signaled to his ambitious generals and his subjects that plotting against him was not just treason, it was a rebellion against the sanctioned order of Islam.
Legitimacy is a great shield, but you can't feed an army with a piece of paper from the caliph.
No, you need cash, you need taxes.
And this brings us to the ICA system. To explain this simply, an Ika was a non-hereditary land assignment. The state gives a noble, known as a muti or wali, a specific territory.
Instead of getting a monthly salary in coins from Delhi, the muti collects the local revenue from that land.
He uses it to maintain a specific number of troops for the sultan, and then sends any leftover surplus, the fawazil, back to the central treasury.
It was a highly practical solution to a massive logistical nightmare. The central authority in Delhi simply did not have the bureaucratic infrastructure, the roads, or the manpower to send tax collectors into every single village across northern India.
It is impossible.
Right. So they decentralized the collection process while trying to centralize the military output.
Okay, here's where I want to look at the mechanics of this, because it sounds incredibly risky. It's like a corporate acquisition.
How do you mean?
Well, the new leadership inherits a massive, complex structure, northern India, and they have to immediately install a middle management system to keep the revenues flowing.
Yeah.
But if I give a seasoned general a huge tract of land, tell him to build an army, and give him the right to collect all the taxes in that region, I mean, aren't I just handing him a starter kit for his own rival kingdom?
That is the exact tension that defined the ecosystem for centuries. And the sultans were hyper aware of that risk.
So how do they prevent it from instantly devolving into localized feudalism, where lords just entrench themselves and ignore the capital?
The mechanism they used is entirely contained in the word non-hereditary. Unlike European feudalism, where a lord passes his lands and titles down to his son, creating deeply rooted local dynasties, the Iksa belonged to the state.
So when Amuchi died, his land didn't go to his heir, it reverted to the sultan.
Exactly.
But even in a single lifetime, a guy can build a lot of local loyalty.
They knew that, which is why the central government utilized a rigorous transfer system. They actively moved these mukis from one province to another every 3 or 4 years.
Oh, wow. I mean, that's incredibly frequent.
Yes. Just as Amuchi was starting to figure out the local power dynamics, just as he was making alliances with the village headmen, Delhi would pack him up and send him 500 miles away to start over.
So they are constantly kept off balance. They're administrators, not lords.
Precisely. The system was meticulously designed to keep them dependent on the Sultan's favor. And as the administration matured, Delhi tightened the leash even further.
They began appointing state accountants.
Yes, called Khwajas. They would sit right alongside the muti. The Khwaja's entire job was to audit the local books, estimate the harvest, and ensure the muti wasn't hiding that surplus revenue.
The fawazil.
Right, that was supposed to go back to the capital.
It is a calculated, paranoid balancing act. You need your middle managers strong enough to squeeze revenue out of the countryside and put down local rebellions, but weak enough that they still answer your letters.
And we can actually see this physical transition from a conquering army to an administrative state in the architecture of the early Sultanate. The buildings they left behind tell the story of their administrative compromises.
Let's take the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque in Delhi, built right at the beginning by Quwwat-ud-Din Aibak. The name literally means might of Islam.
What is notable about this structure is the intense use of spolia.
Right. Spolia is the architectural term for repurposing stone from older buildings. They took carved stones, columns, and materials from dozens of demolished Hindu and Jain temples to build this mosque.
We know this because there's an inscription right on the building stating it was built using the material of 27 temples.
Now, using spolia serves two distinct purposes.
Yeah.
The first is purely logistical.
Yeah. When you have just conquered a territory and you need to assert your presence immediately, you don't have time to quarry fresh stone and train a new generation of stonemasons.
You use what is already cut and available. But the second purpose is deeply political. It is a very stark physical manifestation of regime change.
You are literally building the new order out of the dismantled pieces of the old order.
But it's the engineering that really shows the cultural collision. The new Islamic rulers wanted mosques with vast open prayer halls, soaring arches, and grand domes.
The architectural language of their homelands.
Right, but they were using indigenous Indian artisans who had never built those structures before. So the Indian builders used the technique they knew, which was the corbel arch.
And the physics of a corbel arch are fundamentally different from a true arch. If you watch a child playing with wooden blocks, trying to bridge a gap, they will stack the blocks, sliding each one slightly further over the empty space until they meet in the middle. That's corbeling.
You are relying entirely on the weight of the masonry above to keep those overhanging stones from tipping over and crashing down.
Exactly. And because of those physics, you can't span a very wide distance. It limits the size of the room. It's essentially just a heavily modified post and lintel system.
The indigenous builders didn't yet know how to build a scientific true arch, where you use wedge-shaped stones called voussoirs that push inward against a central keystone, transferring the weight out and down the pillars.
So you look at the Quwwat-ul-Islam Mosque and you see these Indian stonemasons trying to fake a curved Islamic arch by meticulously carving the edges off a jagged, stacked Korba structure.
It perfectly mirrors the political reality we just discussed with the Iqsa system. The rulers arrived with a clear vision of Islamic governance and architecture, but they had to rely entirely on the local materials, the local workforce, and the existing systems to actually build it on the ground.
It was a compromise carved in stone.
So they build this foundation. They have the Iqa system generating revenue. But while they are trying to stabilize internally, a massive storm is brewing to the north.
The Mongol menace.
Right. This takes us into a century of relentless defense against the Mongol Empire. The ecosystem created just enough internal stability to keep the state alive. But external pressure forced the Sultanate to evolve its military capabilities at an accelerated rate.
From 1221 to 1327, the Mongol Empire launched wave after wave of invasions into the subcontinent. We really cannot overstate the terror the Mongols inspired.
They were the most sophisticated, devastating military machine on the planet at that time.
They had obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, they were dismantling China, and they were pushing deep into Eastern Europe.
For the rulers in Delhi, fighting the Mongols wasn't just a border skirmish. It was an existential crisis. It became the primary organizing principle of the state.
Let's trace how the sultans adapted to this threat over time, because their strategy changed dramatically. It starts with Iltutmish.
And his strategy was essentially aggressive avoidance. In 1221, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, who was the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, was literally running for his life from Genghis Khan.
He crosses the Indus River, enters the subcontinent, and asks Iltutmish for asylum in Delhi.
It's a massive diplomatic test. Mingburnu is a fellow Muslim ruler asking for sanctuary.
But Iltutmish refuses. He doesn't just refuse, he actively avoids any engagement.
Because he recognized that Genghis Khan was hunting Mingburnu.
Exactly. If Iltutmish provided shelter, he would be painting a giant target on Delhi. Genghis Khan would have brought the entire unified Mongol horde down upon a sultanate that was barely 15 years old.
By remaining completely aloof, Iltutmish kept the Mongols from having a pretext to push further east.
It's a cold, calculated move, but you can't hide forever. Fast forward to the reign of Ghiyas-ud-Din Balban, who ruled from 1266 to 1287.
Genghis Khan is gone, but the Chagatai Khani Mongols are now a permanent, aggressive fixture on the northwestern frontier. Avoidance is no longer an option.
Right. Balban shifts to a strategy of active, fortified defense. His entire worldview was shaped by the Mongol threat. He implements a doctrine that historians refer to as his blood and iron policy.
He realizes that a decentralized, Iqta-based militia isn't going to stop a highly organized Mongol cavalry.
No. So he begins centralizing the military, turning it into a disciplined standing army. More importantly, he physically alters the landscape.
He rebuilds and heavily garrisons a line of massive forts along the Multan-Lahore-Bees river system.
That geography is key. The rivers act as natural moats. If the Mongols cross the Indus, they hit this fortified river network, which slows down their cavalry and disrupts their supply lines.
He's creating a physical buffer zone.
Yes. But Balban also understood that external defense is impossible without absolute internal security. You can't fight a war on your frontier if your generals are rebelling in your capital.
So he deploys a massive, pervasive network of spies, known as Burids. But how does a spy network actually help you fight a Mongol invasion?
By enforcing absolute unity. Balban used the Burids to monitor every breath his nobles took. He needed to know instantly if any Muti was hoarding Fawizil, if they were plotting a rebellion, or worst of all, if they were opening back-channel negotiations with the Mongols.
The spy network allowed Balban to preemptively crush dissent.
He needed his nobles terrified of him so they wouldn't dare break ranks when the Mongols attacked.
So we have Iltutmish hiding and Balban building walls and spying on his own men. But here is the massive historical question. If the Mongols successfully obliterated established, wealthy, heavily armed empires across the entire Eurasian landmass, How did the Delhi Sultanate manage to hold them off for 100 years without being completely dismantled?
It's one of the great strategic triumphs of the medieval period. And the answer lies in the culmination of this evolutionary process under Alauddin Khalji, who rules from 1296 to 1316.
Alauddin inherits Balban's forts and his spies, but he changes the strategic doctrine entirely.
Right, he moves from active defense to aggressive resistance. He decides the best defense is a terrifying offense.
He refuses to sit behind a wall and wait for the Mongols to besiege him.
To fight the Mongols effectively, you have to meet them in the field. You have to match their mobility and their numbers. To do this, Alauddin builds a military machine of unprecedented scale in Indian history.
We are talking about a permanent standing army of 475,000 cavalrymen.
And here's the crucial administrative leap. He doesn't rely on the ITA system to fund this core army. He pays these soldiers directly in cash from the central treasury.
Why is cash so important compared to land grants?
Commanding control. If a soldier is paid by a local muti through land revenue, his loyalty is local. If he is paid a monthly cash salary directly by the Sultan's treasury, he answers only to the Sultan.
It gave Alauddin a massive, highly mobile, centrally commanded force that could be deployed instantly without waiting for provincial lords to gather their militias.
And we see the brutal effectiveness of this force at the Battle of Amroha in 1305.
Right. A massive Mongol army under the command of Ali Beg and Tartak bypasses the border forts and drives deep toward Delhi. Alauddin sends his central army, commanded by Malik Nayak, to intercept them.
And it's not just a victory, it's an absolute slaughter. The Sultanate cavalry outmaneuvers the Mongols, breaks their lines, and inflicts horrific casualties.
They take thousands of Mongol prisoners back to Delhi and have them trampled by elephants to send a message. It proved unequivocally that the Sultanate could defeat the Mongols in open combat.
The geopolitical implications of this are immense. If we pause and consider the counterfactual, what happens if Alauddin's army breaks at Amroha?
The Mongol invasions caused catastrophic demographic collapse, destroyed centuries of infrastructure, and erased entire libraries across Persia and Central Asia.
By holding the line, the Delhi Sultanate acted as a massive shield. They preserved the demographic and cultural continuity of the Indian subcontinent. South Asia, as we know it today, simply would not exist if the Mongols had broken through.
But saving the subcontinent comes with an astronomical price tag. You don't just magically generate the cash to pay nearly 500,000 cavalrymen every single month.
You don't.
And that leads us into the Khalji Revolution and radical economics, spanning roughly 1290 to 1320. Alauddin Khalji had to squeeze every single ounce of wealth out of his empire to keep that military machine running.
Necessity drove radical innovation. Alauddin was facing a compounding economic crisis. The Mongol incursions were constantly disrupting trade routes. Peasants were fleeing the border regions, which meant agricultural output was dropping.
If he raised taxes too high, the peasants would rebel. If he didn't pay his soldiers, the army would mutiny and the Mongols would win.
He needed his soldiers to be able to survive on their fixed cash salaries, regardless of inflation or supply shocks.
So he essentially attacks the concept of inflation itself. He implements one of the most rigorously controlled, micromanaged economies of the medieval world.
Let's look at the mechanics of these market regulations. He sets up 4 entirely separate, highly centralized markets right in Delhi.
One exclusively for food grains, one for cloth and expensive groceries like butter and sugar, one for horses, cattle, and livestock, and one for slaves.
By physically segregating the markets, he could apply targeted regulations and appoint specialized bureaucrats who actually understood the specific supply chains of those commodities.
And the state dictated the price of absolutely everything, and I mean everything. The price of wheat was permanently fixed at 7.5 jitals per mond.
Let's give that some context. A jital was a small copper coin. A mond, depending on the exact regional variation, was roughly equivalent to about 80 pounds of weight today.
So you're getting 80 pounds of grain for 7.5 copper coins.
It's an incredibly low subsidized price, designed specifically so a cavalryman on a basic salary could feed himself, his family, and his horse.
They fixed the price of barley, rice, cloth, vegetables, even needles and combs. They banned capitalist investors from the horse trade because wealthy middlemen were driving up the prices of war horses.
Brokers in the animal and slave markets were forbidden from taking commissions. But writing a price on a piece of parchment means nothing if merchants just ignore it.
Alauddin enforced this with absolute terror.
He built a massive bureaucratic enforcement arm. He appointed an official called the Shuna, essentially a market dictator, for each of the 4 markets. The Shuna had a registry of every single merchant in the city.
And they controlled the supply chain all the way back to the dirt. Cultivators in the surrounding countryside were legally banned from hoarding grain.
They were forced to sell their harvest at fixed prices directly to state-approved transport merchants who were essentially drafted into government service.
The state built massive, nationalized granaries to store this food, ensuring that even if there was a severe drought, Delhi had enough food to maintain the fixed prices.
And if a merchant tried to cheat the system, the punishments are horrifying to read about.
If a shopkeeper was caught using shaved weights on his scales to shortchange a customer, the Shuna would order an official to cut the exact equivalent weight in flesh directly from the merchant's body.
It was a command economy maintained by state-sanctioned violence and espionage. Spies posed as customers, buying small amounts of bread and bringing it back to the palace to be weighed.
Okay, as we look at this, I have to challenge the long-term viability. This looks exactly like a modern wartime command economy. The state dictates production, crushes free enterprise, and fixes prices to support a massive war effort.
Right.
But modern economics tells us that while this might work for a few years, heavy-handed micromanagement ultimately destroys an economy. It removes all incentive for farmers to grow surplus crops, it stops merchants from importing luxury goods, and it causes long-term stagnation. Didn't Aladdin essentially strangle the economic growth of India just to fund his army?
Well, if you analyze it purely through the lens of modern free market macroeconomics, absolutely. Price fixing destroys the natural signals of supply and demand.
Wow.
However, we have to evaluate Aladdin's policies based on the specific historical crisis he was facing. His metric for success wasn't year-over-year GDP growth. His metric was survival.
Keeping the Mongols out and his own head on his shoulders.
Exactly. And by that metric, the policies were wildly successful. He stabilized the cost of living, which kept his massive army loyal and fed. The granaries functioned perfectly. During his reign, Delhi never starved, even during famines in the provinces.
But there's a deeper political angle here too, right?
Yes, these extreme economic measures were tools of social engineering. By capping profits, seizing surplus wealth, and terrifying the merchant class, Aladdin systematically dismantled the financial power of the nobility and the wealthy elites.
A noble can't fund a mercenary army to overthrow the Sultan if the state has regulated his profit margins down to zero.
It was a radical approach to economic stability that was entirely fused with his need for absolute, unchallenged autocracy.
And the sheer volume of wealth he managed to extract from the peasantry, combined with the massive plunder he brought back from his military campaigns down into the Deccan Plateau, funded an explosion of architectural capability.
We talked about the clunky corbel arches of the early period. Under Aladdin, we see the Alai Darwaza.
This was built as a southern gateway to the Quet complex in Delhi.
The Alai Darwaza is a major milestone. It physically demonstrates the economic and technological leap the Sultanate had made. It marks the absolute mastery of the true arch and the true dome on scientific lines in India.
They've finally figured out the physics. They're no longer stacking flat stones. They're carving precise, radiating voussoirs.
And they are using high-quality lime mortar to bind the stones together. The building features gorgeous horseshoe-shaped arches, detailed with a delicate lotus bud fringe along the inner curve.
It doesn't look like a compromise anymore. It looks incredibly confident, utilizing striking contrasts of red sandstone and brilliant white marble.
It is the architecture of an empire that has stopped surviving and started thriving. They have secured their borders, centralized their wealth, and imported the engineering knowledge they needed.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the most chaotic chapter of our deep dive. The Khaljis built this highly powerful, centralized machine. When the succeeding Tughlaq dynasty takes over in 1320, they inherit all of this stabilized infrastructure, a full treasury, and secured borders.
And this leads us to the Tughlaq era, covering 1320 to 1388. The Tughlaqs, flush with resources, attempt massive, sweeping, and often disastrous imperial experiments.
The defining figure of this entire century is Muhammad bin Tughlaq, ruling from 1325 to 1351.
He is one of the most polarizing figures in medieval history. He was a genuine polymath. He was deeply educated in Islamic theology, Greek philosophy, higher mathematics, astronomy, and clinical medicine.
He debated scholars for fun. Yet his reign is defined by administrative catastrophes. He had huge ideas that completely failed on the ground.
The most infamous example is his order in 1329 to shift the imperial capital from Delhi all the way south to Daulatabad, a fortress city in modern-day Maharashtra.
Now, intellectually, the strategic logic was perfectly sound. Thanks to the conquest of the Khaljis, the Delhi Sultanate now controlled vast territories deep into southern India.
Right. Muhammad bin Tughlaq looked at a map and realized that trying to govern the Deccan Plateau from Delhi, which is practically in the foothills of the Himalayas, was a logistical nightmare.
Communication took weeks. Daulatabad offered a geographically central location to administer a pan-Indian empire.
The logic was sound, but the execution was a horror show. He didn't just move his court and his bureaucrats. He ordered the entire civilian population of Delhi, the merchants, the weavers, the scholars, the beggars, to pack up their lives and march roughly 700 miles south.
To truly understand the human cost of this, we have to look through the eyes of an eyewitness. The Moroccan traveler, Ibn Battuta.
Ibn Battuta is a gift to historians. He traveled further than Marco Polo across the entire Islamic world and arrived in Delhi in 1334.
Muhammad bin Tughlaq loved surrounding himself with foreign scholars, and he was so impressed by Battuta that he appointed him as a quasi and imperial judge.
Battuta held this high-ranking position for 7 years, giving him an intimate, terrifying view of the court.
Battuta's descriptions are incredibly vivid. He describes Delhi before the evacuation as the largest, most magnificent city in the entire Muslim Orient. It was actually an amalgamation of 4 distinct, massive cities: the Old City, Siri, Tughlaqabad, and Jahanpana.
But because of this forced march to Daulatabad, Battuta describes walking through Delhi and finding it eerily, silently empty.
The march south was brutal. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of people through central India without modern sanitation or supply lines led to massive death tolls from starvation and disease.
And if you refuse to leave, Battuta relates a grim anecdote. The Sultan's guards found a blind man who had hidden in Delhi. They tied him to the bumper of a cart and dragged him the 700 miles to Daulatabad.
Battuta notes that by the time the cart arrived, nothing remained of the man but one of his legs.
It perfectly illustrates the terrifying duality of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He had the intellect to envision a centralized pan-Indian state, but he possessed an absolute despotic disregard for the human friction required to achieve it.
Ibn Battuta captures this perfectly when he describes the Darsera, the Sultan's royal court, specifically the protocol of the 3 doors.
Right. To get an audience with the Sultan, you had to pass through 3 successive gates.
But Battuta's description of the first door is chilling. He notes that stationed directly at the first entrance were the imperial executioners, sitting right alongside a troupe of flute players and singers.
It's this jarring juxtaposition, beautiful music and immediate bloody death right at the threshold of power. That is Muhammad bin Tughlaq's reign in a single image. High culture intertwined with arbitrary terror.
And we see this again with his economic experiments. In 1329, he attempts to introduce a token currency.
Again, the underlying economic theory is actually sound. There was a global shortage of silver bullion in the 14th century. The state treasury was strained.
So Tughlaq decides to issue coins made of cheap copper and brass, but he legally decrees that these base metal coins carry the exact same value as silver coins.
He's essentially inventing fiat currency centuries before it becomes the global standard.
But fiat currency requires absolute trust in the state, and it requires advanced metallurgy so people can't forge it. He had neither. The state mints didn't have milled edges or complex watermarks. It was just stamped copper.
Within weeks, every blacksmith, every coppersmith, and every peasant with a fire and a hammer started melting down their pots and pans to mint their own money.
The state was completely flooded with fake coins. People paid their taxes in forged copper and hoarded their real silver.
The economy completely collapsed, and Tughlaq eventually had to recall the token currency, paying out real silver for mountains of worthless fake copper, bankrupting the treasury.
So was he a visionary born centuries too early, or a tyrant totally detached from reality?
He was a brilliant theorist, but a catastrophic pragmatist. He understood the what and the why of imperial administration, but he entirely lacked the bureaucratic machinery to handle the how. He expected reality to conform perfectly to his intellectual theories, and when it didn't, he resorted to brutal force.
And just as the Khalji wealth manifested in the Allied Darwaza, the financial strain of Tughlaq's experiments physically manifests in the architecture of this era. The Tughlaq buildings are a massive stylistic shift.
They are the architecture of a strange treasury. The Tughlaqs could no longer afford intricate sandstone carvings or massive expanses of white marble.
Their structures, like the colossal Tughlaqabad fort built by Ghiyas-ud-Din Tughlaq, are very austere. They are unadorned and grim.
They stopped using precisely cut dressed stone. They used rough, irregular rubble masonry covered in thick plaster. And to compensate for the structural weakness of the rubble, they used a technique called batter.
This is where the external walls are built with a very pronounced, deliberate slope, leaning inward as they go up.
A battered wall is thicker at the base, which lowers the center of gravity and provides immense structural stability, especially when you are using inferior materials. It looks like a bunker.
The architecture of the Tuglacs prioritized brute strength, harsh functionality, and military defense over any artistic grandeur. It is the physical reality of an empire that has exhausted its resources.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about these sweeping decisions by the sultans, moving capitals, changing currencies, fighting Mongols. But an empire of millions of people doesn't survive for 3 centuries just because one guy gives an order.
No, beneath the throne, there is a massive engine running the day-to-day operations. To understand how this volatile state held together, we need to look at the administrative machinery and the pen of the historian.
Autocracy is the theory, but bureaucracy is the practice. The Delhi Sultanate developed a highly sophisticated administrative state. The Sultan's power was channeled through specific, highly organized departments known as diwans.
The functional division of labor is impressive. You have the Diwani Wizarate, which is the massive finance department headed by the wazir. They calculate tax yields across thousands of villages and manage the central treasury.
You have the Diwaniyars, the military department. They don't just fight. They manage the logistics, keeping the muster rolls, inspecting horses, and ensuring the cavalry is actually paid.
The Diwani Insha handles all state correspondence and archives, and the Diwani Qazi-e-Mamalik is the central department of justice.
This complex bureaucratic web is what allowed the center to actually enforce the transfer of the muchis and collect the surplus fawazil. But our ability to understand how these departments actually functioned on a daily basis relies almost entirely on the historians of the era.
And the towering intellectual figure here is Ziauddin Barani. Barani is central to our understanding of the Sultanate. He wrote 2 major works.
The first is the Fatwa-e-Jahandari, which is a theoretical manual of statecraft.
It's essentially a book advising Muslim kings on how they ought to govern according to his worldview.
And his second book is the Tarikh-e-Feroz Shahi, which is a detailed narrative chronicle of how the sultans actually ruled, covering the history from Balban all the way through to Feroz Shah Tughlaq.
Barani wasn't an outside observer. He was a deep insider. He came from an elite family that had been embedded in the Sultanate's administration for generations. He personally served as a Nadim, a close court companion and advisor, to Muhammad bin Tughlaq for 17 years.
He understood the psychological mechanics of power perfectly. But here is where we have to critically evaluate our lens on history. Barani's writing is dripping with intense bias.
He was an unapologetic elitist.
He firmly believed that political power and administrative office should be the exclusive birthright of the established highborn nobility. He writes with absolute venom about upstarts, lowborn men, merchants, or converts who rise through the ranks to gain power.
And to make matters more complicated, after Muhammad bin Tughlaq died, Barani lost all his political influence. He ended up living in abject poverty and disgrace under the next sultan.
So my question is, if our primary foundational text for understanding the entire machinery of the Delhi Sultanate is written by a deeply bitter, elitist insider who lost his job and despised social mobility, how do we separate the actual administrative facts from his personal grievances?
That is the ultimate puzzle of medieval history. You don't try to strip the bias away to find the facts. You use the bias to illuminate the facts.
How so?
Barani viewed the mechanics of history as a constant, triangular struggle between a despotic monarchy, the established highborn nobility, and the non-aristocratic classes.
Though when he complains, he's actually revealing a truth.
Exactly. When Barani dedicates pages to fiercely criticizing Muhammad bin Tughlaq for appointing a gardener's son or a weaver to a high position in the Diwani Wizarate, we learn 2 critical things.
First, we learn Barani's personal prejudice.
But second, and far more importantly, we learn the historical fact that incredible social mobility was actually occurring within the Sultanate's bureaucracy.
The state was becoming desperate for competent administrators, and they were promoting people based on merit, not just bloodlines.
Barani's bitter complaints are the very evidence that the old, rigid aristocracy was losing its monopoly on power.
That is a highly analytical way to read a source. And Barani is also pragmatic when it comes to the law. In his Fatawa-e-Jahandari, he emphasizes the concept of zawabit.
This is crucial for understanding how the state functioned. Barani was a devout Muslim, but he recognized that strictly applying traditional Islamic law, the Shariat, was administratively impossible in a sprawling, massively diverse empire where the vast majority of the population was Hindu.
So he argued that rulers must enact Sawabit. Sawabit are essentially secular state laws. They are regulations based purely on political expediency, maintaining public order, and the practical realities of administration, rather than religious doctrine.
The fact that a conservative historian like Barani is arguing for secular state regulations shows just how mature and complex the Sultanate's administrative machinery had become.
While the chroniclers and the wazirs were obsessed with high politics, taxation, and the purity of the nobility, a completely different, much quieter revolution was happening at the grassroots level.
And this takes us into the cultural synthesis and the legacy of Amir Khusrau.
The Delhi Sultanate was not just a military occupation. It was the crucible for a profound cultural fusion. You have Persian administrators, Turkic warlords, Afghan mercenaries, and millions of indigenous Indian civilians all forced to interact daily.
And the ultimate personification of this blending is Amir Khusrau. He's a prominent historical figure. He was universally known as Tuti Hind, the parrot of India.
He was a poet, a master musician, a scholar, and a highly skilled courtier who managed to survive the violent politics of Delhi well enough to serve 5 different sultans. He was of Turkic descent, but he proudly referred to himself as an Indian Turk.
His political survival at court was impressive, but his spiritual life is what drove his cultural impact. Khusrau was deeply embedded in the Sufi tradition. He was the most devoted disciple of the great Sufi saint Nizamuddin Auliya.
The spiritual bond between the two men was so profound that Auliya famously declared he would refuse to enter paradise unless Khusrau was allowed to enter with him.
Khusrau's intellectual output bridges entirely different worlds. He wrote his official panegyrics and histories in formal Persian, which was the language of the elite court.
But he is heavily credited with developing and elevating Hindavi. Hindavi is the vernacular language, the blending of Persian and Arabic vocabulary with local North Indian dialects, which eventually evolves into modern Hindi and Urdu.
He wrote folk poetry and riddles in Hindavi that ordinary people could understand and sing. He was translating the emotional landscape of the Persian court into the language of the Indian state.
And his impact on music was just as notable. Khusrau deeply studied indigenous Indian classical music. He then blended it with Persian maqam to craft entirely new musical forms.
He is credited with developing the khayal style of singing, which is less rigid than older forms, allowing for more emotional improvisation. He created several new ragas.
And while musicologists still debate the exact historical timelines, enduring cultural legends credit him with the invention of the sitar and the tabla, modifying older Indian instruments to suit these new blended musical styles.
He is the catalyst for what becomes known as the Ganga Jamuni culture. This broader Indo-Islamic synthesis was being propelled forward not by kings, but by spiritual movements.
The Bhakti movement within Hinduism and the Sufi movement within Islam were both gaining massive traction during this era. Both movements fundamentally rejected rigid, orthodox rituals and instead emphasized a direct, personal, emotional devotion to the divine.
And because they both focused on mystical devotion rather than dogma, they created a massive space for cultural intersection. We see this vividly in the eastern provinces like Assam, where you see the creation of forms like jikirs.
Jikirs are Islamic religious teachings, but they are composed and sung using the exact poetic patterns and musical structures of Assamese Vaishnava poetry. It's a seamless blending of theology and local form.
It really is.
This aspect is worth examining, because when you read the political history, it's just relentless trauma. Mongol invasions, armies of 500,000 men, horrific taxation, skinning merchants alive, forced marches across the subcontinent. How does this cultural synthesis manage to take root and flourish in an environment that seems so overwhelmingly violent and oppressive?
Because culture is highly resilient. And it doesn't just happen inside the Sultan's palace. The concept of the Ganga Jamuni culture represents the inevitable, pragmatic blending that occurs when diverse peoples are forced to share the same physical space for centuries.
The Turkic rulers couldn't import millions of artisans from Central Asia. If they wanted a mosque built, they had to hire local Indian stone carvers.
If they wanted the eco-revenues calculated, they needed local Hindu accountants who understood the village systems. The nobles patronized local musicians. The realities of daily economic survival, the shared experiences of drought or famine, and the physical proximity in the markets forced a melding of traditions.
The political chaos raged at the top, but the cultural roots were mingling deep underground. And we can see this cultural maturity reflected physically in the architecture of the later dynasties. the Sayyids and the Lotus.
The architecture shifts dramatically from the brute force of the Tughlaqs. The Sayyids and Lotus didn't have the massive territorial wealth of the Khaljis, so they couldn't build colossal fortress cities. Instead, they focused their resources on highly refined funerary architecture.
The structural innovation that defines this late period is the double dome. You can see this perfectly preserved in the tombs and Lodi gardens in Delhi.
To understand why this is a big deal, you have to look at the physics and aesthetics of a single dome. If you build a massive, towering single dome so it looks impressive from the outside, the interior ceiling becomes so high that it's just a dark, cavernous, disproportionate void for the people standing inside the tomb.
Right. The double dome solves this. They build an inner dome, proportioned perfectly to create a serene interior space. Then they build a second, much taller outer dome over the top of it, separated by an empty void, to give the building that soaring profile against the skyline.
It demonstrates a complete mastery of engineering, blending structural necessity with highly refined aesthetic proportions.
But this quiet elegance in stone was masking a rapidly decaying political foundation. We are entering the final act, the twilight of the Sultanate covering the Lodi dynasty and the First Battle of Panipat, from 1451 to 1526.
The central administrative engine that had kept the empire running for 300 years finally breaks down. It breaks down because the fundamental nature of the ruling class changes. The Lodi dynasty, which takes power in 1451, was of Afghan origin.
This is a crucial distinction. The previous Turkic dynasties ruled through a highly centralized autocratic bureaucracy. The Sultan was absolute and the nobles were subordinates.
But Balu Lodi, the founder of the dynasty, imports a traditional Afghan model of tribal governance. He essentially treats the empire like a massive tribal confederacy. He doesn't view himself as an absolute autocrat. He views himself as the first among equals.
And that is a fatal shift for a centralized state. By treating his powerful Afghan nobles as tribal equals, he decentralizes power. The Ikna system, which relied on constantly transferring the mutis to keep them weak, begins to break down.
The Afghan nobles start treating their massive land grants not as temporary administrative posts, but as autonomous hereditary fiefdoms. The central treasury in Delhi loses its tight grip on the revenue and the military command.
Balu's successor, Sikandar Lodi, recognizes the danger. He tries to tighten the reins. In 1504, he formally shifts the capital from Delhi to Agra, moving the center of power to better control the rebellious regions.
He tries to enforce orthodox policies to unify the state, but the tribal fractures are already too deep. When Ibrahim Lodi takes the throne in 1517, the situation becomes completely unmanageable.
Ibrahim Lodi completely lacked the diplomatic tact and the tribal consensus-building skills of his grandfather. He was headstrong, arrogant, and aggressively tried to strip power away from the top-ranking Afghan tribal factions,
Particularly the Lohani, Farmuli, and Niazi nobles. He demanded absolute obedience.
He actively antagonizes the only people keeping him in power. He imprisons Dilawar Khan, the son of Daulat Khan Lodi, who happens to be the incredibly powerful governor of the Punjab. This is political suicide.
The alienation becomes so profound that Daulat Khan Lodi decides he'd rather risk destroying the empire than serve Ibrahim. Daulat Khan makes a monumental decision. He sends an invitation to Kabul.
He invites the ambitious Timurid prince Babur to cross the mountains, invade India, and overthrow Ibrahim Lodi.
Daulat Khan Lodi made a catastrophic geopolitical miscalculation. He assumed Babur would act like previous raiders from the north, march in, defeat Ibrahim, loot the treasury, and then retreat back to Kabul, leaving a power vacuum for the local Afghan nobles to fill.
He completely failed to realize that Babur wasn't looking for plunder. He was looking for a permanent empire. Which brings us to the defining narrative vignette of this entire era, the First Battle of Panipat on April 21st, 1526.
Let's really look at the mechanics of this battlefield. On one side, you have the Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi, commanding the traditional massive Indian army. He fields an estimated force of 100,000 men, supported by at least 1,000 heavily armored war elephants.
On the other side, you have Babur, the invader, with a veteran but tiny force of roughly 15,000 men.
It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of entirely different military eras.
I want to look at this mechanically. It is like a massive, slow-moving dreadnought battleship facing a swarm of highly agile torpedo boats. Ibrahim's massive army relied entirely on overwhelming shock tactics. You send a wall of 1,000 elephants forward to crush the enemy lines, followed by a human wave of cavalry.
Babur counters this with speed, discipline, and something entirely new to northern India: field artillery. Babur's victory is often chalked up to he had guns, but it was actually a masterpiece of combined arms tactics and battlefield engineering.
He deployed two specific tactics, the Tuluma and the Araba. Let's break down how those actually worked on the field. The Tuluma was a highly coordinated flanking maneuver. Babur didn't just line his men up in a block. He divided his army into distinct units, a center, a left wing, and a right wing.
Then he subdivided those wings into forward and rear divisions. This structure allowed his fast, highly mobile cavalry wings to swing incredibly wide, completely bypassing the massive, slow-moving front line of Lodi's army, enveloping them from the sides and the rear.
He essentially trapped 100,000 men in a tightening circle.
But to execute a flanking maneuver, your center has to hold firm. If Lodi's elephants crashed through Babur's center, the battle was over. This is where the Araba comes in. It was an improvised defensive barricade.
Babur ordered his men to gather hundreds of baggage carts. They tied these carts together using thick ropes made of raw animal hide, forming a solid physical wall across his front line.
Behind this wall of carts, Babur positioned his matchlock infantry and his cannons, protected by wheeled wooden shields called mantelets. This meant his gunners could carefully load, aim, and fire their gunpowder weapons without the sheer terror of being overrun by charging cavalry.
And the physical and psychological impact of those cannons was apocalyptic. Ibrahim Lodi had no field artillery. When Babur's cannons fired, the deafening roar and the smoke completely terrified Lodi's war elephants. The beasts panicked, turned violently around, and charged blindly back into Lodi's own dense ranks.
Thousands of Lodi's men were trampled to death by their own elephants. The gunpowder and the tactics were undeniably decisive. But if you analyze the battle critically, the fatal flaw of the Sultanate wasn't a lack of cannons. It was the complete collapse of their internal political foundation.
The fractured nobility.
Exactly. Ibrahim Lodi fought bravely. He died sword in hand on the battlefield. But he was abandoned by a massive portion of his own army. Many of his generals were disaffected Afghan nobles who despised him. They held their troops back. They refused to engage.
Babur himself noted in his memoirs that his own troops were rapidly exhausting their ammunition and their energy. They had no reserves.
If the Afghan nobility had simply maintained a united front, if they had fought with cohesion and loyalty, the sheer, crushing mass of Lodi's 100,000 men would have eventually absorbed the cannon fire and exhausted Babur's small force.
The Sultanate didn't just fall at Panipat because of superior technology. It fell because its internal political structure had completely rotted away from the inside.
With Ibrahim Lodi dead in the dust at Panipat, the Delhi Sultanate comes to an abrupt, violent end, and the era of the Mughal Empire begins.
So what does this all mean for you listening today? We've spent this time digging deep underground, excavating the foundation of a fallen empire. The political entity known as the Delhi Sultanate vanished amidst the smoke and the trampling elephants at Panipat. But its legacy is embedded in everything that followed.
Consider what the Mughals actually built upon. Babur didn't start from zero. The Mughals inherited the deeply ingrained administrative DNA of the Ikka system, which they simply refined and rebranded as the Mansabdari system to fund their own massive armies.
They inherited the vast, complex urban layouts and the architectural engineering of Delhi's many iterations. And perhaps most importantly, they inherited the vibrant linguistic fusion of Hindavi and the deeply rooted Ganga Jomini culture that still fundamentally defines the region today.
The Sultanate was a chaotic, often brutal, incredibly volatile 3 centuries, but it laid the invisible, indispensable bedrock for the empire that followed. It is a legacy built not just on conquest, but on 300 years of relentless adaptation.
It perfectly illustrates that empires are rarely erased. They're absorbed. Their administrative compromises, their cultural fusions, and their survival mechanisms become the raw materials for the next builders. So the next time you're looking up, admiring a towering monument of the Mughal era, take a second to look down at your feet. Think about the hidden foundations. Think about the iron, the spies, the desperate price fixing, the poets blending melodies, and the staggering ambition that poured that concrete in the dark. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.